hard to believe it's been 3 months. Had an excellent summer series, wonderful speakers, great topic, or great theme, I guess, and a great series of topics. But if you don't remember, we left off, I was teaching chapter 5 there at the end of May. Looking forward to Roger picking up chapter 6. And just as things worked out, I get to pick up chapter 6. Which is not bad at all. When it comes to the studying Daniel, these first 6 chapters are the ideal chapters if you're teaching, because they're not overly challenging to understand. They're great to explore, and they're great to dig into, but they're not really that hard to understand. Beginning in chapter 7, it gets a whole lot more challenging. It's a lot more like the book of Revelation. It's a lot of looking forward, things that are in the future, apocalyptic language. So I'm thrilled that I get to do chapter 6 here before we get into the really tough stuff. So since it's been 3 months, we're going to do a little review. So I put this together when we actually looked at chapter 5 just to kind of give you a feel of the timeline of how things went. If you went back to 605 BC, that was when Nebuchadnezzar defeats Egypt. At that time, Egypt controlled Judah. So thereby, they gained control of Judah, administrative control of Judah. 597, Nebuchadnezzar's army lays siege to Judah, and he takes some of the people. So he actually conquers Judah. They resist, so he conquers them. And he takes away choice people at that time. Said, those who are of the nobility and those who have an aptitude for learning. So he takes them back with him. 586, Nebuchadnezzar comes back and basically just levels Jerusalem. They had resisted again his rule, and he was done playing around with them, so he just basically flattened the country and took everybody captive who was left to resettle them somewhere else. 562, Nebuchadnezzar dies. This is following chapter 4, after chapter 4 of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar dies, and he's followed by a quick succession of different kings who rule over Babylon. That's going to culminate in Nabonidus. In 556, he comes to the throne, but he decides to leave his son in charge. That's Belshazzar. We read about him in chapter 5. We encountered him, not a very smart fellow, pretty much full of himself. That never works out too well. I think we've recently had a president who had that issue. And something occurs there in chapter 5, and Daniel, who's been kind of out of the limelight for quite a while now, since Nebuchadnezzar left, is suddenly back in the limelight, or back in the forefront. In 539, the Medes, under King Cyrus, take over Babylon. Darius, a Mede, is placed in charge. In 538, and this is not part of Daniel, but just so you understand the flow of things. So here, just another year later, Cyrus decrees that the Jews are permitted to return to Judah out of Babylon. And then in 536, many scholars believe this is when Daniel died in the 3rd year of Darius's rule, which would suggest to us then that Daniel got to live to see the time that the Israelites get to return to Judah. And I've got to think that that had to be a very satisfying thing for him. He had been given the vision, he had interpreted some other writings that we're going to read about later, that he understood that their captivity was going to last 70 years. So that had to be satisfying, I would think, to Daniel, to get to see the fulfillment of that. God's promise, fulfilled that they would get to return, and he got to witness at least the beginning of that. So if we look back at the first 5 chapters, just the real highlights. Chapter 1, we had the Jewish captives, and that included Daniel, who are taken away back to Babylon. They're to be trained and raised as Babylonian leaders. Daniel distinguishes himself, and he has several friends who apparently distinguish themselves as well. Chapter 2, we encounter King Nebuchadnezzar's first dream that we read about in Daniel. It was the dream of the statue that was made of many different things. He didn't tell anybody what the dream was, but he told them, "You tell me what the dream was and interpret it to me." Now, there were magicians and Chaldeans that were in his kingdom, who that was pretty much their job, was to be the people who can interpret dreams or advise him on things that only gods would have to whisper in their ears the right thing to do. So he really stumps them here. They can't just take what he tells them and come up with some plausible explanation for it and shoot it back to him. They've got to tell him what the dream was. None of them could do it, but Daniel could. Daniel not only told him the dream, but he explained to him what it meant, and that put Daniel in a position that he was promoted ahead of many others. What do you think the usual response is when one person gets promoted ahead of a bunch of other people? They're not usually out there, congratulating him, slapping him on the back. They've already started plotting ways to get rid of him. Chapter 3 is the situation of Nebuchadnezzar erecting a giant idol that everybody in the nation is to bow down and praise. And we encounter three of these people that we met with Daniel early on: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they refuse to bow down to the idol because it's sin. God told them not to have another god before him. So these three say they simply won't do it. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, has to act upon it. They aren't doing what he's instructed them to do. He threatens them. He's going to put them in the fiery furnace. Their answer is, if that's what you have to do, go ahead and do it. But we're not changing our minds. We're not going to worship that idol. And as we all know, they were spared from the fire, from the furnace, by an angel sent by God. I want you to remember that, because I'm going to bring that back up here in a couple minutes. Chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar had another dream, so we move back away from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we're back to Daniel. And it's about a tree that grew tall and basically nourished everything around. And this represents Nebuchadnezzar himself and the nation of Babylon. He has this dream about the tree then being chopped down, and everything seems to go to waste because of it. Everything scatters. He asks his magicians again, interpret the dream, although this time he actually tells them what the dream was. I think he was hoping that he'd get the answer he wanted, so I'll explain the dream, right? Now, whether they simply couldn't interpret the dream, or whether they understood the meaning of the dream and just really weren't, I don't want to tell him what that means. That's not good news. I'm not going to be the one telling them. They all say they can't interpret it. But of course, Daniel can, and he does explain it. And he tells the king up front, I really wish this wasn't about you. Kind of suggests Daniel liked Nebuchadnezzar a little bit anyway. Said, I really wish this wasn't about you. I wish it was about your enemy, but this is not good news for you. That's you. You're the tree, and you're about to fall because of your own pride. We learn that it actually comes true in about a year. Nebuchadnezzar spends a lot of time running around as a wild animal, grazing. Finally comes to his senses and recognizes God and his authority and his power. He's restored back to the throne. Keep that in mind. I'm going to bring that up again. And chapter 5 was about Nebuchadnezzar passing, the succession of kings that I talked about when we looked at the chronology, and this new king, Belshazzar. He's really the son of Nebuchadnezzar, and some scholars suggest that his father had kind of disappeared from the kingdom because he knew things weren't too far from going south. Didn't know when, but he knew that that Medo-Persian army was eventually going to conquer them, and he didn't want to be around for it. There's really not, that's just speculation on their part. We really can't be sure about that. But Belshazzar is in charge. He's another guy who's way too full of himself, and God sends a very clear message as it's carved into the wall by a moving hand. Of course, none of Belshazzar's people can or will interpret it. Again, maybe they know what it means. The suggestion that it probably may not have been, because it may not have been a language they understood. But even if they did understand it, they didn't want to tell him bad news, just like Nebuchadnezzar's didn't want to. Daniel is brought forth. Somebody remembers, his wife remembers, there's this guy who used to be able to interpret dreams and things. Maybe he can help out here. He brings in Daniel, and Daniel explains it to him, what's going to happen. Says, you're about to fall. Well, Belshazzar had made a big promise. Whoever can explain this to me, I'm going to make him just after me in charge. He says you'll be the third ruler. And the idea being that his father is first, Belshazzar is second. So this person would be third after Belshazzar. So he puts the robes on Daniel, and that very night is when the Medo-Persian Empire or army invades Babylon and overthrows them, and Belshazzar is killed that very evening. Darius becomes ruler. If you read commentaries, you can find as many opinions about who Darius is as there are commentators. So some suggest that Darius is simply another term for Cyrus, so that this is indeed Cyrus, the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. That doesn't seem terribly likely to me, just for the fact that I can't picture him being there for this long siege that the army has been doing against the Babylonian capital. I can't just picture him hanging around for that. He's running an entire empire. I figure he has people in charge of that. Others suggest this is the general that has led the army, that has finally overthrown Babylon, and that he's placed there as the king, a title, to basically be the surrogate for Cyrus. He knows he needs to do what Cyrus wants done, but he's basically in charge right there. Uh-oh, it's doing a Roger on me. It's doing a big Roger on me. All right, so that brings us to chapter 6. And as I got to studying for chapter 6, I was actually really excited. One of my thoughts was I really ought to just go over here to the kids' class and bring one of them in and let them explain this whole thing, because they've heard this story many times. It's one of our favorites to teach children about, isn't it? Daniel and the lion's den. But like I said, I have enough notes that as I got into it, I realized, there's more to talk about than just the story that we tell the kids. So I guess I better actually spend the time, write the notes, and come up here and talk to you about it. Let's look at by starting with the first 2 verses. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. So I found it interesting as we read here that Daniel is recognized by yet another ruler. He was recognized by Nebuchadnezzar, he was recognized by Belshazzar, and now by Darius. And he's placed in a lofty position yet again. You got to wonder, how did Darius decide this is one of the 3 highest people I'm going to place in the kingdom? Did he maybe have spies inside the capital before the overthrow happened, kind of scoping out who's in there, who can we trust, who can't we trust? That's possible. Or was it simply because Daniel had been elevated by Belshazzar right before Belshazzar was eliminated? Maybe they just said, well, whoever's in charge, you kind of keep your positions. But that isn't really what the text says, right? It says he picked 120 people plus 3 high officials. Or was it, and I think this is the most likely, was it something that Darius saw in Daniel? Daniel seems to impress everyone who comes in contact with him. Wouldn't it be great if we, in our Christian walk, had that same influence on everybody we encountered? That was their opinion of us, that in a short meeting, if a position like this opened, we'd be their choice. We might be tempted to credit Darius as a great judge of character because of this choice, but when we look at his other 2 selections as we continue this study, he only made it 1 for 3. That's not really good odds. So I'm not going to give him credit for being a great judge of character. I talked about the fact that the identity of Darius is debated by scholars, some believing him to be Cyrus, others the general of the army. But as we read through this, it really seems to me like that Darius is someone Cyrus has chosen to put in charge. So the idea of him being that general of the army really fits into my understanding of how this flows. Again, that's my opinion. We have no concrete evidence one way or another. It's not terribly different from what we'll see later in the Roman Empire, is it? You have one Caesar over all of Rome, but look at all the governors who ruled over the various territories. Caesar didn't try to go out and rule this huge empire one-on-one. He had people he trusted to take care of territories for him, and I think that's what Darius is here to Cyrus. Darius appoints 120 satraps. We can think of them as administrators or governors. That suggests that he managed the former Babylonian Empire as, looking upon it, as 120 districts that needed to be managed. So you appoint 120 leaders, 1 to each district. These 120 administrators report to 3 people who are called high officials. Now we know who Daniel is, but who are these other 122 people? I would tend to think that a lot of them are people Darius has known and trusted. Think about it. If you just conquered with your army, don't you probably have a lot of other generals, majors, captains, colonels, whatever you want to call them, down through your ranks who have been your trusted associates now for years? Would you probably not appoint people you knew and trusted into these positions? I would tend to think so. And it is also interesting to me the phrase, so that the king might suffer no loss. And again, there's different opinions by scholars and commentators, but I think the real idea here is that he wanted to make sure that Cyrus suffers no loss. This isn't the idea that Darius doesn't suffer loss. Darius wants to make sure this goes well so that Cyrus doesn't suffer loss, therefore he doesn't get in trouble. If things don't go well here, the person who has to answer for it is Darius. So Darius is very motivated to make sure that things go well here. The Medo-Persian Empire was not known for being a forgiving set of rulers. You did your job or you paid the price. Decided to work again. Verse 3. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. That kind of put him back where he was under Belshazzar for a couple hours. Not that I'm comparable to Daniel in any way, but I have worked at the job that I'm at since 1999, I guess. In that time, the company I've worked for has changed names or been brought out or been replaced something like 9 times. Acquisitions, mergers, takeovers, you name it. And when the company that I currently work for came in, and they just weren't sure they were going to hire all of us, and they made that very clear to us. And my response to them was, I was here before you came, and I will probably be here when you're gone. Because they're happy with the people who are here. It's just you people who administer us, you come and go as they're happy with you or not happy with you. That's the way it works. I kind of think that when I look at Daniel. The people come and go, the rulers come and go, Daniel stays around, keeps doing what he's doing. Daniel is recognized again due to his great character, and that's a result of his faith in God and his dedication to provide true and honest service to God. Few of us would have followed Daniel if he had done as little as possible in service to these kings. Think about it. Babylon had conquered Judah, his homeland. Would we fault Daniel if he wasn't doing the best he could for these people who had conquered his homeland? Same idea for these new Medo-Persians. This had become his new home. They had just conquered it. Would we, as individuals, probably fault Daniel if he hadn't done what was in their best interest going forward? Probably not. Would we be that quick to serve people so faithfully who had conquered us? But Daniel recognized that what was occurring was part of God's plan, and that God had given him abilities for a reason. Daniel was here in this place with the abilities that God had given him for a purpose. Maybe Daniel understood it, maybe he didn't, but he accepted that God had a purpose for him being here and him having the abilities he had. He could do no less than use those abilities to the best of his ability to serve God. In the New Testament, we're told that as Christians, we should be the best citizens that any nation has. That we should be working for the good of those around us at all times. And that should benefit whatever nation we live in as Christians, right? I think that's kind of the attitude that Daniel had here. If I'm going to be faithful to God, I'm always going to do my best. If that benefits the king, it benefits the king. That was God's purpose for whatever reason. The nice thing about this study, unlike the last 13 weeks on Sunday mornings, I don't have to get through the whole chapter, Michael. I just get as far as I need to, as time allows. Verses 4 and 5. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find the ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Daniel's been dealing with jealous peers since chapter 2 when he interpreted that first dream for Nebuchadnezzar. While certainly not true of all who hold office, it's not uncommon for people like Daniel's peers here, the other two high officials and these satraps, who hold powerful positions to be there because of their personal ambitions for wealth, power, and or prestige, rather than because they have a genuine desire to serve others. Daniel's peers, the satraps and the other two high officials, are jealous of him. They're looking for ways to eliminate the competition. They can't beat him. He's too honest. He's too upright. They just can't compete with that. So they've got to find another way to get rid of him. They have nothing that they can point to in regard to his service to the king that they can bring against him. When I thought about that, so Daniel's been doing this for more than 50 years. He's been in service to the king of Babylon and now the Medo-Persians for over 50 years. Could you picture a powerful political figure today that you could look back over 50 years and not find a skeleton in their closet? That's hard to imagine. I'm sure there are people like that, don't get me wrong, but that's certainly not what we think of when we think of people in these powerful positions, is it? So they conspire to find a way to charge Daniel, and it's going to involve his faith in God. This speaks both to Daniel's high character due to his faith, as well as these conspirators' low character, that they will charge him in a matter that is completely unrelated to his duties to the king and is not even illegal at the time that they're coming up with this idea. Verses 6 through 9. Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials in the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction, that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. So the jealous cohorts set their trap. We can take from the language that both of the other high officials, along with at least some portion of the satraps, are in agreement to find a way to get Daniel out of the way. It wouldn't be fair, though, to presume that all of the satraps are in agreement with this plan. Let's face it, have you ever seen 120 politicians agree on anything? That would be a first. They approach the king and start by buttering him up. Now, granted, this is a routine way to greet the king, but they're laying it on thick. O King Darius, live forever. The implication is, you're so great, King Darius, we wish we'd never have to have anybody else. They waste no time getting to the lie, though. They state that all of the high officials and satraps are in agreement with what they're about to propose. Well, we can definitely think of one who's not going to be in agreement, can't we? Daniel's certainly not. But their implication is, we've talked to everybody, and they all agree this is the thing to do. I find it interesting that Darius never questions the fact that Daniel isn't with them. It was his intent to make Daniel the top man, right? And yet he's not here talking about this at all. I would have thought personally, I would have at least called Daniel and said, hey, how come you didn't come and present this? It also occurred to me, I wonder, and we're not told this, are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego still around? If they were, we'd tend to think maybe they'd be one of these 120 satraps. They were important officials under previous administrations. Again, maybe he went solely with people he knew. But we can pretty much bet they would not have been in agreement either. They know Daniel to be a man who is faithful to God, and that Daniel prays to God regularly, every day. Daniel doesn't do this to be seen by men. In contrast to the Pharisee we read of in Luke 18. Remember, Jesus talks about the Pharisee who goes up and looks upward and says, God, I thank you that I'm not like these other people. You've made me so great, basically. Boy, I'm just glad I'm not like them. And then the publican who can't look up and simply says, forgive me, a sinner. Way to be seen by others or to be admired by others, he does it privately in his home. The jealous cohort suggests that the king issue an ordinance or a law that no one is permitted to pray to anyone, not a god, not a person, other than the King Darius himself, for the next 30 days. They're working on the king's fears and on his vanity. They invoke the idea of fear. They spark a little fear by pointing out that the people in your kingdom worship a lot of different gods. That could be dangerous for you. That could create factions. Start pitting people against people. Really disrupt your empire here. See that playing out today, don't we? People are becoming more and more polarized over various topics that just make things more and more tense within our nation. So it's a realistic fear for Darius. I don't want people getting all worked up. The suggestion is, if they're all looking to you, then they'll stop looking at these other gods. They also work on his vanity. The idea that the subjects of the kingdom should pray to him as if he were a god. Good things never result when we seek to have other people look at us like a god. Never turns out well. And this situation is no exception. They propose the harshest of punishments for anyone who violates this new law, death. Now, to be fair, in both the Babylonian and Medo-Persian empires, there wasn't a whole lot of lesser offenses. Pretty much if you offended the king, you died. So it could be a little thing, it could be a big thing. Wasn't surprising they sought a death sentence here. One of the things I found interesting was that this is one of those areas that people who like to criticize the Bible or are critical of the Bible look and say, well, look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They threw them in a furnace. Well, it doesn't make sense they'd throw them in a lion's den now, right? If throwing them in the furnace was a way to get rid of people, wouldn't that be the way you'd do it? I don't understand this particular word, but here's the explanation. So when we look at the Persians, they are Zoroastrians. So among their beliefs is that fire is sacred. So actually to a Persian, it would have been sacrilegious toward the fire to have thrown a person into it to be killed. So just a little tidbit, if you run into one of those critics who point this out for you, there's a reason for that. There's a reason that they didn't threaten to throw him in the fire. Never would have found that word if I hadn't done the study. So they urge him to sign it into the law, which would not only make it binding, but irrevocable. In the Medo-Persian Empire, once a king wrote a law, he couldn't unwrite it. Darius is taken in by the lie. In his mind, if they all agree, it must be a good thing, and he signs it. How many times do we see people do something because everybody's doing it? You know, there's that little voice in the back of your head that says this isn't right, but everybody's telling you it's the right thing to do. Maybe I'm just off then. Maybe I should go along with them. Darius just rides the wave. Everybody says it's the right thing to do. I'll go along. Makes you wonder if his mother ever asked that question, if your friends jumped off the bridge, would you jump off the bridge too? I don't know, do moms ask that of girls? Okay. I didn't know if it was just a boy thing. I'm sure I frustrated my mother, don't get me wrong, but she never asked that of my sisters. Maybe they were just much more compliant in life than I was. I don't know. Verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Daniel has heard about this new law. He has a choice to make. It's his custom to pray to God 3 times a day, every day. Now, he could have said, okay, for the next 30 days I won't do that. But he knew in his heart that was not right. And unlike Darius, Daniel doesn't go along with what everybody else says. He's the example we should hold up for our kids when we say, you don't have to follow the crowd. Daniel didn't follow the crowd. I was a little surprised in one sense. I would have thought they would have hid the new law from Daniel, tried to find a way to keep him from hearing about it so that he wouldn't even be tempted to not fulfill his normal activities. But then I also thought if he didn't know about it and then got caught and brought before the king, he might be tempted to say, well, nobody even told me about this law. And if Darius has any sense at all, if Daniel wasn't even told about the law, how did he agree with it in the first place? Could have gotten ugly for them. So they don't hide it from him. He knows about it. How does Daniel respond? It's a model for us. He was a very loyal servant to the kings, but he had to draw the line when serving them would have meant failing to serve God. That's true for us today, too. We should be the best citizens. We should be the most law-abiding citizens there are, except when our government passes laws that contradict God's will. Then we are obligated to follow God's will over our government. We should be willing to serve those who are in charge of us, mayors, governors, Congress, presidents, so long as serving them does not conflict with serving God. So we've got to set aside those matters of opinion of things we don't like. Whether you're in favor or not in favor of masks or vaccinations or any of the many things that are going on today, those aren't things that interfere with our service to God or contradict God's will for us. So when it comes to a law, we should be willing to abide by it, right? So long as it's not contrary to God's will. That does not mean we refuse to serve things over difference of opinion, but only in matters that contradict our obligations to God. Daniel doesn't hesitate to pray to God as he had always done. Some may think that risky, disobeying the king's law, but Daniel knew the bigger picture. It was riskier, incredibly dangerous, to violate God's law. If he violates the king's law, the worst thing that can happen to him is that he physically dies. And that's not the worst thing that can happen to any of us. The worst thing that can happen to us is if we spiritually die. And Daniel recognized that and made that choice. Whatever may happen, I will serve my God. And that's certainly a lesson that we can all take as well. So I'm going to stop after verse 10. Roger will be able to pick up with verse 11. Quick show of hands. So usually people get up here and say, don't actually raise your hand, just want you to think about it. I really want you to raise your hand here. Would you prefer to see us try to move into like the back 2/3 and come down to continue these studies on Wednesday nights? Or do you want to remain spread out? So how many of you would like to see us concentrate down on the floor? Okay. How many of you are pretty happy the way we are spread out? Okay. I'm not saying we'll change that, but Roger and I are meeting Sunday for our elders meeting, so that will be one of our topics of discussion. Mark, have our closing prayer?